Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Living Ancestor podcast. This is your host, Ramon Castellanos from Eating Ancient Virtue. And today, I wanted to discuss with you the way that the deep ancestors show up in our day to day lives in ways that are seemingly very mundane, but also very powerful. And they have a shaping influence on what's possible for us on certain levels, but also how we respond to situations that take us out of the rational thinking mind. So, instinct. And this comes from a few experiences that I've had recently. And one of the layers that emerged out of that was a deepening into understanding and feeling the ancestors as living presences, as opposed to just spiritual forces that we connect to when we are engaged in some kind of ritual process. And this is something that I'm always doing and on the lookout for. It's how the ancestral emerges into day-to-day life and how it can show up in surprising and small ways. Because the ancestral is a living field of energy that we are in continuous relationality with, as opposed to just this class of spiritual forces and or genetics that we connect to and then turn off that connection when we aren't consciously working with it. It's not binary, it's ongoing. And so the two experiences that I've had come from one of them being a potential accident that I just nearly escaped. And it came from driving along this three-way intersection out here in the Big Island of Hawai in Kona on the western side. And this intersection is notorious. People get into accidents there, and it's just this cluster zone that creates havoc. And it's not aided by people who simply aren't paying attention, as is a very common theme in today's modern world. People jump into cars going 80 miles an hour in this very dangerous set of circumstances, and they're just, completely zoned out thinking about this or thinking about that, and don't realize that there's real danger when driving a vehicle. And I think a part of this is the disconnect that a lot of people have from their environment. But nonetheless, I was driving along the straight line of an intersection, and this car just completely just jumped out in front of me. They weren't paying attention to what they were doing, and I hit the brakes super hard and missed getting into an accident. So then I come home, I tell my wife about it, and she says, "Well, did you thank the spirits that were with you and protected you?" And, of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, it wasn't the spirits. Those were my reflexes, because I've always had very quick reflexes. And she says to me, well, those are your deep ancestors. And it was like a light bulb. Very insightful and very true. Is that the deep ancestors were showing up in that moment with a blessing. She specifically said those were the blessings of your deep ancestors. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the terminology, deep ancestors refer to the deep time ancestors. So not the last few hundred years or even the last few thousand years. More so, we're talking about 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years. And then even further back into the animals that were at the root of our species before humans became Homo sapiens, as we know and love them today, so to speak. So those ancestors, the ones that are truly ancient and who lived a certain kind of life way, over innumerable millennia, and certain patterns either aided them in their survival and in their ability to reproduce and to thrive, and certain patterns didn't. And the patterns that were helpful to the species, to keep the species alive and thriving, got embedded deeply into the very structure of the creature. In our case, that is our reflexes. And there's other layers too, but our reflexes are blessings from the deep ancestors. And they can show up in all kinds of ways. And if it wasn't for certain patterns, a certain ability to respond at a level that was deeper than the conscious mind's capacity to conceptualize its environment, then we would likely have died multiple times already in our lives. Because that deeper intelligence that emerges, that was and is at its core ancestral, is doing a lot of work for us. And especially under threat of any kind, it shows up even deeper and more obviously, like in this situation where I was saved by the blessing of the deep ancestor that gave me these reflexes. Now, this is interesting because even at the level of movement practice, there are ways to tag the intelligence, to call it in, so to speak, of the deep ancestors. And you often find this in what we would call primal movement patterns. So movements like crawling, for example, where for humans we have the opposite hand and limb moving together. So right arm and left leg move together, and left arm and right leg move together, and we crawl. And we see this movement in babies. Well, one of the things that makes crawling such a powerful exercise is that every time we lift opposite hand and limb, reflexes fire throughout our entire nervous system to stabilize our spine and to allow us to locomote forward. And this is a deeply ancient pattern that is woven into the very structure of the human being. That's how we walk, is left arm with right leg and right arm with left leg. And crawling is really just, in some senses, horizontal walking, or you could say that walking is vertical crawling, or upright crawling to be more accurate, because vertical crawling could also be climbing, for example. But that is embedded into the movement itself. It's very difficult to undo the reflex that occurs when you lift your opposite hand and foot. Now, one of the things that can actually bring us in connection with deep ancestral ways of feeling is crawling, because it's been done for eons on this planet and started off with creatures on the ocean floor. But again, the reason that movement is what it is because it triggers our reflexes. So the reflexes and the instincts are the deep ancestors giving us a blessing, because those are patterns that have worked themselves out over long periods of time and have proven, in the grand totality of things, to work in our favor, to help us move towards auspiciousness, towards thriving. That is the definition of a blessing. Now, another experience that I had recently was that I spend a lot of time on the coastal regions of the Big Island of Hawaii. And on the coastal regions here, on this island in particular, there's a lot of lava rock. So what you encounter is a lot of lava rock beaches, and the primary beach that I spend most of my time on, the primary coastal region, is called Wawaloli. And there is primarily lava rock coast. So not so much white sand beaches. And inside of these tide pools, little, or as the tide rises, little tide pools form inside of these lava rock landscapes, which are absolutely stunning and beautiful. And fish, little tiny tide pool native fish, gather. And one of the ones that I'm specifically thinking about is called a blenny. Anyway, it's a small little fish, and it has a very distinctive pattern. It sits in the tide pool, and as I was watching it, I realized that what it was doing was deeply influenced by its deep ancestors. So they sit there and they hop, and then they stop, and they look around, and they look for, as far as I can tell, they're looking for threat, for movement that is responding to their movement. So once they realize that nothing has responded to them moving, they hop again. And then they repeat this process, and there's this hopping, and they go from place to place to place. And when I was watching them initially, I couldn't figure out why they were doing that. And I was thinking, why this idiosyncratic pattern? And then I realized what it was. It was an inheritance from their deep ancestors, that pattern, that instinct to move in that way is what allowed their ancestors to survive and then thrive to some degree because of the nature of the ocean, which is the large fish eat small fish. And so as a tide pool creature, there's also birds that would eat them and whatnot. So this is an interesting example of how its simple orientating behaviors, why it chooses to do one thing over the other, is influenced by their deep ancestors too. And so I was starting to reflect on how that shows up for us in our day-to-day life. And while the example of almost running into a car and having the blessing of the deep ancestors show up as a reflex that protected me from dying is, that's really overt. There's also smaller, subtle ways in which this shows up. And that is, our instinct, for example, to seek out the comfort of other humans, to seek out warmth, to be able to read people at a very primal level. I mean, yes, that's a skill, reading people, that we can develop, and some people are better at it than others, but everybody has some basic level, for the most part, right? There could be nervous system divergences that might interfere with that, but as a general, humans have this capacity to read one another. And the ways in which we have a sense to protect ourselves from the elements, the way we respond to pain, and how pain protects us. And so, people who have leprosy, I believe, is the disease, when the brutal, changes that you see in their bodies emerge out of a loss of being able to feel pain. And so they stop actually protecting themselves when they're around fire and instruments that could cut them. And so their bodies just get warped and deformed because of constant injury. So the pain is a blessing too in that way, right? Or at least it can be. And so all these small ways that we have these deep instincts that are embedded into us, that are shaping influences that direct our behavior in some ways, are blessings from the deep ancestors. Now, of course, there are times when some of these things can absolutely feel like they're a curse, right? And it's possible for any blessing to become a curse under certain circumstances, but that's a talk for another day. However, I wanted this to help you kind of feel into and even notice how the deep ancestors are showing up in your experience on a continuous and ongoing basis, and how their presence has actually saved your life, likely multiple times. And that if it wasn't for this deep communication pathway between the ancient world and the modern world, you probably couldn't survive. Yeah? And when we can really grasp that and simply live with it side by side, that's ancestor work. And that's some of the most potent ancestor work that I know of. Not necessarily the most potent, but some of the most potent. Is when we stop fetishizing the ancestral as only spiritual forces or as this niche of focus that gets some of our attention some of the time, and more so as a continuous, ongoing, living field of relationality that we are embedded into and that we are a part of. Because as we exist and as we gather patterns, and these patterns are tested to some degree, we're feeding an information flow into the future for future generations. So, I hope this was helpful for you or interesting, and I appreciate you being here with me. Now, shameless plug, of course. That's a necessity in today's world. Can't have a podcast without it, apparently. And that is that if you appreciated this podcast and if you're interested in what I'm doing and want to stay connected, I would love it if you came and joined me at eatingancientvirtue.substack.com and just signed up for the free account just so that you can know when I release these kinds of things. And also, I release free previews to courses, and correspondence comes through there that only emerges in that space. And with that said, be well, my friends.